They told you some secrets die with time. They were wrong. Some secrets wait, patient, silent, until the exact moment you're weak enough to hear them. 95 years. That's how long the chest stayed sealed. Not forgotten. No, understand this clearly. It was left alone. There's a difference. Forgotten things decay. Avoided things, they watch. Picture it. A church that smells of dust and old wood, where prayers have been repeated so many times they've lost meaning, where men kneel not to confess truth, but to bury it deeper. In the corner of that room, untouched, unmoved, sat a cedar chest. No ornament, no beauty, just weight, just silence. And silence is never empty. You've been taught to trust places like that, churches, institutions, places where morality is supposed to live. But what if those walls weren't built to protect truth, but to contain it? That chest wasn't locked to keep people out. It was locked to keep something in. Think about that. Because when a thing is hidden for nearly a century, it's not history anymore. It becomes intention. It becomes design. Someone wanted this to stay buried, not just physically, but psychologically. They wanted generations to grow up walking over it, praying above it, living their lives completely unaware of what lay beneath their feet. And that's where the real power begins. Not in what people know, but in what they never question. You've lived your entire life inside systems built long before you were born, systems that reward obedience, punish curiosity, and label discomfort as disrespect. But discomfort is where truth leaks out. It's the crack in the structure, the signal that something underneath isn't right. That chest was a crack, a fracture in the illusion, because inside it wasn't just paper, it wasn't just objects, it was something far more dangerous, evidence, not just of cruelty, but of coordination, of silence enforced not just by fear alone, but by agreement. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for you. Because men like you, men who seek truth, power, control over their own mind, you're not supposed to hear stories like this. Not in full, not unfiltered. You're given fragments, sanitized versions, clean narratives that keep your world stable. But stability is often just ignorance dressed as peace. The moment that chest opened, something shifted. Not just in that room, but in the structure of belief itself. Because once you see what was hidden, you can't go back to trusting what's visible. And I need you to understand something before we go deeper. This isn't just a story about a church, or a plantation, or a chest. This is about systems that train entire communities to protect lies without ever realizing they're doing it. And by the time you reach the end of this descent, you won't just be listening anymore. You'll start recognizing the patterns. And once you see the pattern, you become dangerous. The man who opened the chest didn't believe in ghosts. That's important, because men who believe in ghosts expect fear. They anticipate something unnatural. But men grounded in reality, men trained by war, by blood, by consequence, they don't expect the past to reach back. And that's exactly what happened. His name was Roy Drain, 27 years old, a carpenter, a man who had already seen enough death in the Pacific to understand one brutal truth. Evil doesn't announce itself. It operates quietly, efficiently, and often under the illusion of order. You need to understand Roy, because in many ways he represents you. Practical, focused, not interested in myths or whispers. He wasn't looking for secrets. He was there to fix a leaking roof, rotting beams, faulty wiring, tangible problems, problems with clear solutions. That's how most men live. They deal with what's in front of them and ignore what's beneath. But reality doesn't care about your comfort. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It reveals itself when the structure gets disturbed, when someone starts pulling at threads that were never meant to be touched.
Roy didn't open that chest out of curiosity. He opened it because it was in the way. Think about that. The greatest discoveries, the most dangerous truths, are often uncovered not by seekers, but by disruptors, by men who refuse to leave things as they are. And that's what made him a threat. The church didn't see it that way, of course. To them, he was just labor, a tool, a pair of hands sent to restore something old. But they didn't realize you can't repair a structure without exposing its weaknesses. And this structure, this church, was built on something far more fragile than wood. It was built on silence. Roy noticed the chest early, heavy, out of place, not decorative, not useful, just present, like an object that had outlived its purpose but couldn't be discarded. That alone should have told you something. In controlled environments, nothing remains without reason. Everything has a function, even if that function is psychological. That chest wasn't there for storage. It was there as a boundary, an unspoken rule embedded into the environment. Do not touch this. And what's fascinating is how effective that kind of control is. No guards, no warnings, no signs, just decades of quiet agreement. Generations of people walking past it, cleaning around it, acknowledging its existence without ever questioning it. That's how conditioning works at its highest level, not through force, but through normalization. You don't resist what feels familiar, and familiarity is the most powerful cage ever designed. Roy didn't share that conditioning. He wasn't raised in that church. He didn't inherit its silence. He came from outside the system, and that made him unpredictable. And systems hate unpredictability, because one man asking the wrong question, touching the wrong object, pulling at the wrong thread, can unravel everything. The morning he decided to deal with the chest, there was no sense of destiny, no dramatic buildup, just heat, still air, the kind of oppressive quiet that makes your skin feel tight, the kind of quiet that exists right before something breaks. He knelt in front of it, ran his hand across the wood, felt the resistance in the lock, and for the first time, something unusual happened. Not fear, hesitation, a subtle instinct, a signal from somewhere deeper than logic. You've felt it before. That moment when something inside you says, leave it alone. But here's the difference between most men and the ones who uncover truth. Most men listen to that voice. Roy didn't. And that decision, that single act of ignoring instinct in favor of action, is what brought the past back to life.
The moment before truth is revealed is never loud. It doesn't come crashing in like thunder. It creeps. It lingers. It waits for your guard to drop just enough for it to slip through. Roy didn't feel fear. Not yet. What he felt was resistance. Not from the chest, but from something deeper. The kind of resistance that doesn't come from the outside world, but from the part of you that senses consequence before your mind can explain it. You've experienced it. That quiet friction when you're about to do something irreversible. When something inside you whispers, once you see this, you won't unsee it. Most men step back in that moment. They rationalize, they delay, they convince themselves it's not worth the trouble, because staying blind is easier than carrying truth. But Roy had already lost the luxury of comfort. War does that to a man. It strips away illusion. It teaches you that hesitation doesn't protect you, it just postpones the inevitable. So when the metal groaned under his tools, he didn't stop. He leaned in. Every strike of the chisel against the rusted lock echoed through that small room, louder than it should have been. Not because of the sound itself, but because of what it represented. Each hit was a violation. Not of property, but of silence. And silence, when it's been maintained long enough, becomes sacred. You break it,
and something always answers. The lock didn't give easily. It resisted, screamed under pressure, held its ground like it understood its purpose. That's the thing about old mechanisms. They were built with intention, designed not just to secure, but to endure. And this one had endured nearly a century. Ask yourself why. Why preserve something so carefully only to abandon it in plain sight? Why protect something and then pretend it doesn't exist? Because the most effective hiding place isn't distance, it's proximity. Keep something close enough, visible enough, normalized enough, and no one will question it. Until someone does. The final strike came without ceremony. A sharp crack, metal giving way, and just like that, 95 years of enforced silence broke open. But here's the part they don't tell you. Opening the chest wasn't the real moment, it was what came after. Because when the lock fell, something shifted in the air, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real, like pressure changing before a storm. The lid didn't fly open. There was no dramatic reveal, just a slow movement, controlled, measured, as if even now the truth inside demanded to be handled with care. And when the seal finally broke, it wasn't the sight that hit him first. It was the smell. Old paper, dry wood, something aged beyond recognition. But underneath that, something else, something that didn't belong to objects, something that felt like memory. You need to understand this. Objects carry energy, not in the mystical sense you've been taught to dismiss, but in the psychological imprint of what they've witnessed, of what they've been part of. And this chest had witnessed something no one wanted remembered. Roy paused, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because in that moment, without fully understanding why, he knew this wasn't just a box. This was a message, preserved, protected, waiting, not just for anyone, but for someone willing to open it. And now that it was open, there was no closing it again. Not really, because the moment you expose truth, it doesn't go back into the dark. It follows you. It changes how you see everything that comes after. And as Roy looked inside for the first time, he wasn't just staring at objects. He was staring at the beginning of something that would dismantle everything he thought he understood about history, about morality, and about the people who claimed to stand for both. At first glance, it didn't look like anything dangerous. That's how deception works at its highest level. It doesn't scream. It doesn't reveal itself with chaos or disorder. It presents itself as organized, clean, intentional, almost respectable. Inside the chest, everything was placed with precision, not tossed in panic, not hidden in haste. Arranged. That alone should disturb you, because chaos hides mistakes, but order preserves meaning. The ledger sat at the center, thick, leather-bound, heavy with the kind of weight that doesn't come from paper, but from what's written on it. Beneath it, a sealed letter, folded carefully, wax intact, as if the writer believed, no, knew, it would be opened one day. Then the map, faded, hand-drawn, not decorative, functional. And finally, the comb. Small, bone, worn smooth by hands that had long since turned to dust. You need to slow down here, because every one of these objects was chosen, preserved, positioned. This wasn't storage, this was a record, and not the kind meant for public eyes. Roy reached for the ledger first. Of course he did. Men are drawn to structure, to information that looks official, something bound, something recorded, something that feels legitimate. That's how control systems operate. They teach you to trust what's documented, to believe that if something is written cleanly, recorded properly, archived carefully, it must carry authority, it must represent truth. But what happens when the system itself is corrupt? What happens when the records are accurate, but the morality behind them is rotten? That's when documentation becomes something else entirely. Not truth, justification. Roy opened the ledger, and in that moment, the illusion began to crack. The handwriting was flawless, elegant, precise, the kind of script that speaks of education, discipline, control. This wasn't written by a madman. It wasn't chaotic or erratic. It was written by someone composed, someone deliberate, someone who believed he was right. That's what makes it dangerous, because the worst atrocities in history aren't committed by men who see themselves as villains. They're committed by men who believe they're maintaining order. The first entries didn't scream horror. Names, ages, numbers, structured, clean, almost boring. But then your mind catches up, because those numbers weren't measurements. They were values. And those names weren't employees. They were owned. That's when it hits you. Not all at once, not dramatically, but like a slow tightening around your chest. This wasn't a business record. This was an inventory of human lives, reduced, calculated, categorized. And here's where it gets even darker, because the entries weren't just financial. They were observational. Notes, comments, judgments, intelligent, easily influenced, resentful, loyal. Think about that. This wasn't just a system of physical control. It was psychological profiling. Long before modern systems of behavioral analysis, this man was documenting personalities, tracking tendencies, identifying weaknesses. Why? Because control isn't just about force. It's about understanding the mind of the one you're controlling. And once you understand that, you don't need chains anymore. You need patterns. You need leverage. You need predictability. Roy kept reading, and with every line, the structure became clearer. This wasn't random cruelty. It was organized, refined, optimized. A system built not just to exploit bodies, but to manage minds. And suddenly that church, the place meant to represent morality, started to feel different. Because the man who wrote this wasn't an outsider. He wasn't hidden away. He was part of the foundation, respected, trusted, integrated into the very structure people look to for guidance. Let that sink in, because this is where the illusion begins to collapse. The same hands that recorded sermons recorded ownership. The same voice that spoke of righteousness calculated human value. And the same institution that preached truth protected this record for nearly a century. Not destroyed it, not exposed it, preserved it. Which means this wasn't a mistake, it was a decision. And decisions like that don't just belong to the past. They echo forward, into systems you still live under, into structures you still trust, into narratives you've never questioned until now.
The moment you realize something is wrong, your mind tries to protect you. It tells you there must be context, that there must be some explanation that softens the edge, some missing piece that makes it less brutal than it looks. That's conditioning. You've been trained to reconcile discomfort, not confront it. Roy felt it too. As his eyes moved across the pages, there was a part of him, small, almost instinctive, that tried to frame it differently. Maybe it was just how records were kept back then. Maybe this was normal for the time. Maybe. No, that's the trap. Because evil rarely hides behind chaos. It hides behind normalization. Line after line, the pattern became undeniable. Names followed by numbers. Ages followed by dollar values, and beneath them, notes that revealed something far more disturbing than ownership: awareness. Keep from books. You need to sit with that for a second. Not uneducated, not unable. Keep from books. That's not a description, that's a command. That's control. That's someone identifying intelligence and choosing to suppress it. Because knowledge is the first fracture in any system of domination. You don't need to chain a man who understands nothing, but the moment he begins to see, he becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability is the enemy of control. So what do? You limit exposure. You restrict information. You shape the environment so learning becomes impossible. And if that fails, you isolate the ones who think differently. That's not history. That's a blueprint. Roy's grip tightened on the page, because now it wasn't just disturbing, it was familiar. Not in form, but in function. Different era, different tools, same principle. Another entry. Broken of the habit. Clean, simple, almost harmless until you understand what it implies. No detail, no explanation, just the result. That's how systems hide violence. They remove the process and leave only the outcome. You don't see the punishment, you see the compliance. And over time, that becomes the narrative. They adjusted, they learned, they stopped resisting. But the reality is always buried between those words. Roy didn't need the details. He had seen enough in the war to know exactly what that phrase meant. Force, pain, repetition. Until the mind disconnects from resistance. Until survival becomes obedience. And obedience becomes identity. Another line has reported others. Now it gets deeper, because this is where the system evolves. It doesn't just control from the top, it infiltrates from within. It creates division, incentivizes betrayal, turns individuals into extensions of the structure itself. Because once people begin policing each other, the system no longer needs to enforce anything. It becomes self-sustaining, self-protecting, self-perpetuating. That's the highest level of control. Not domination, participation. And now you start to understand something uncomfortable. This wasn't just about slavery. It was about engineering behavior, tracking it, adjusting it, refining it. A system designed not just to own bodies, but to shape thought, to predict action, to eliminate resistance before it even forms. Roy turned another page, but by now the ledger wasn't just a record, it was a mirror. Not of the past, but of a pattern that doesn't disappear. It adapts, it evolves, it hides itself in more sophisticated forms. But at its core, it remains the same. Control the information, control the environment, control the relationships, and eventually, you control the individual. That's what this was. Not just cruelty, not just injustice, but a system so refined it didn't just survive, it left a blueprint. And the real question isn't what happened back then. The real question is, how much of that blueprint still exists around you right now?
The deeper Roy read, the more something began to disturb him. Not just the cruelty, not even the numbers. It was the tone. Calm, measured, controlled. You expect monsters to sound monstrous. Rage, hatred, violence. You expect those things to bleed through the words of a man capable of owning other human beings. But that's not what he found. The writing was composed, almost clinical, like a physician documenting symptoms. And that realization carries a weight most men aren't prepared for, because it means the man who wrote this ledger didn't see himself as evil. He saw himself as responsible. You have to understand the psychology of that. True systems of oppression don't survive through hatred alone. Hatred burns hot and burns fast. It creates chaos, instability. No. Systems that last generations are built by men who believe they're maintaining order. Men who believe their actions are necessary. Men who believe the structure itself is sacred. That's how corruption embeds itself into institutions. Roy turned another page. More names, more notes, but now the details became sharper, more personal. Mother to little May. Think about the strange humanity of that observation. The man writing these records acknowledged family bonds. He noticed relationships. He understood connection, and still, he priced them. He documented a child, 3 years old, with a value attached to her existence. 3 years old, assigned a price. That's not just cruelty. That's conditioning so deep it removes the boundary between humanity and property. And once that boundary disappears, anything becomes possible. Roy felt something shift inside him then, a quiet anger, the kind that builds slowly, like pressure beneath the surface, because he began to understand something that most history books never confront directly. The men who built these systems weren't all sadists. Many were educated. Many were religious. Many believed they were morally upright. That's the terrifying part, because it means the system didn't depend on monsters. It depended on ordinary men who accepted the rules. Ordinary men who prioritized stability over truth. Ordinary men who looked at suffering and convinced themselves it was simply the way things are. Roy had seen that mindset before, on battlefields, in command tents, in decisions that sent young men to die while leaders spoke calmly about strategy. Different setting, same psychology. Another line caught his eye. Resentful. Just that word, underlined. Now this was something different, because resentment means someone recognizes injustice. It means the illusion has cracked, and once that happens, control becomes much harder to maintain. That's why systems fear awareness more than rebellion. Rebellion can be crushed. Awareness spreads. Roy realized the ledger wasn't just documenting labor. It was tracking psychological states, identifying threats, mapping personalities. Imagine that level of control. Imagine watching people so closely that you can categorize their emotional patterns. Who's compliant, who's intelligent, who might resist, who might betray. This was more than ownership. It was surveillance. Primitive compared to today's standards, but the intent was identical. Observe, record, predict, manage. The same 4 pillars used in every advanced control system ever created. Roy closed the ledger for a moment, not because he had finished reading, but because he suddenly understood something that made the room feel smaller. This wasn't just a historical artifact. This was evidence of something far bigger, proof that the machinery of control didn't begin in modern times. It was already evolving, centuries ago. Different tools, different language, same objective. And the most chilling realization of all, the man who wrote these entries was not hiding. He was respected, a leader, a man trusted by the community, a man whose voice carried authority inside the very church Roy was standing in. Which means the corruption wasn't outside the institution. It was woven directly into its foundation. And once you realize that, you start asking a much more dangerous question. If systems like this could exist openly back then, how many systems today operate just as quietly, just as efficiently, while convincing everyone they represent truth?
There's a moment when information stops being data and becomes weight. Roy crossed that threshold without realizing it. At first, he was reading. Now, he was absorbing. And absorption changes a man. Because once something settles into you, once it bypasses logic and hits something deeper, you don't just understand it, you carry it. The ledger wasn't just exposing a system, it was exposing a mindset. And that mindset didn't feel distant. It felt calculated, intentional, alive. Roy flipped another page slower this time, not out of caution, but because something inside him had started resisting the act of knowing more. You think you want truth until you feel what it does to you. Another entry, loyal. Simple word, clean, positive, but in this context, it meant something else entirely. Loyal to what? Not to family, not to self. Loyal to the system that owned him. That's when Roy understood something most men never fully grasp. Language is one of the most powerful tools of control. Words don't just describe reality. They shape it. They redefine it. They invert it. Loyal becomes obedience. Disobedient becomes independent thought. Resentful becomes awareness. Broken becomes compliant. Once language is restructured, morality follows. And when morality shifts, people stopped questioning what should never be accepted. Roy had seen it in war. Orders reframed as necessity, losses reframed as sacrifice, death reframed as strategy. Same pattern, different battlefield. Another entry. Has lost 2 of her own. No elaboration, no pause, just a note beneath a price. This one hit differently, because now the ledger wasn't just cold, it was indifferent. And indifference is more dangerous than cruelty. Cruelty still recognizes pain. Indifference ignores it completely. A system built on cruelty can collapse under its own brutality, but a system built on indifference can last forever, because no one inside it sees a reason to stop. Roy's breathing slowed, not from calm, but from control. The kind of control you use when something inside you is trying to react and you force it down, because reacting doesn't help, understanding does. He realized the ledger wasn't written for emotion, it was written for efficiency. Every word served a function, every observation had a purpose, nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary. That's how you know something is designed. Random cruelty leaves chaos, engineered systems leave patterns, and this was a pattern. Roy reached the final pages and something about them felt different. Fewer entries, more space, as if something had changed, as if the system itself had shifted. Then he saw it, a date, August, and suddenly everything tightened, because you felt this before, that moment when scattered information begins to align, when pieces that seem separate start forming a single, undeniable shape. The ledger wasn't just recording lives, it was building towards something specific, something contained, something that didn't belong in open record. Roy didn't know exactly what had happened yet, but he knew this much. Whatever occurred around that time was important enough to mark, important enough to document differently, and important enough to eventually hide. Because remember, this ledger wasn't destroyed, it wasn't burned, it wasn't erased, it was preserved, sealed, protected. Which means someone at some point made a decision, not to forget, but to delay, to push the truth forward in time until it reached a moment when no one connected to it could be held accountable. That's how long-term control works. You don't just hide the truth, you outlive it. You let generations pass, you let memory fade, you let history become distant enough that when it resurfaces, it feels like something that no longer matters. But here's the flaw in that strategy. Truth doesn't lose power with time, it compounds. Because when it finally surfaces, it doesn't just reveal what happened, it exposes who benefited from the silence. And Roy was about to find out exactly what that silence had been protecting.
Up to this point, everything Roy had seen was controlled, structured, contained within the mind of the man who wrote it. But then he reached something different, something that didn't belong to the system, the letter. You need to understand the shift here. The ledger was power speaking. The letter was truth breaking through it. Roy didn't open it immediately, and that hesitation, that pause is something most people overlook, but it matters, because instinctively he knew this was different. Records can be studied, numbers can be analyzed, but a voice, a real voice from the past, that's something else entirely. That's not information. That's confrontation. The wax seal cracked with a dry snap, a small sound, but final, irreversible. And just like that, a voice that had been silenced for nearly a century was about to speak again. The handwriting was different, still careful, still deliberate, but not refined in the same way. There was effort in it, strain, like every word had been earned, not practiced. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't written by someone with power. This was written by someone who took power, one letter at a time. To whoever opens this, that's how it began. Not a name, not a plea, just an acknowledgement. As if the writer already understood something most people don't. The truth doesn't need a specific audience. It just needs time. Roy read slowly, not because he couldn't go faster, but because something inside him forced him to absorb every word. To my name is Nora. A name, simple but powerful, because the ledger had stripped names of identity, reduced them to entries. And now, one of those names was speaking for itself, reclaiming something that had been taken. You need to see the contrast. In the ledger, Nora was a line, a value, a note. In this letter, she was a mind, a voice, a presence. And that difference is everything. She described her life without dramatics, no exaggeration, no attempt to convince, just facts, clear, measured, controlled. And somehow that made it worse, because emotion can be dismissed, but clarity? Clarity forces you to face reality as it is. She spoke of learning to read, not being taught, not being given permission, learning by watching, by observing, by stealing moments. That right there is power in its rawest form, because systems can restrict access, but they can't fully suppress curiosity. And curiosity is the beginning of freedom. She watched lessons from a distance, listened to sounds, traced letters in dirt, practiced in darkness. Every step a risk, every word an act of defiance. Think about that. While the system was tracking behavior, she was studying the system itself, understanding it, decoding it. That's the first stage of breaking control. You don't fight it blindly, you learn how it works. Roy felt something shift again, but this time it wasn't anger, it was recognition. Because what Nora described wasn't just survival, it was strategy. She wasn't just enduring the system, she was analyzing it. And that made her dangerous. More dangerous than rebellion, more dangerous than force. Because once someone understands the structure, they can find the weak points. And weak points are where everything begins to collapse. She spoke of whispers, of shared understanding, of something forming beneath the surface. Not loud, not visible, but real. A network, a quiet resistance, built not on strength, but on awareness. And that's when the realization becomes unavoidable. The system wasn't perfect. It was being studied from within, observed, mapped, tested by the very people it was designed to control. And that means something critical. No system is ever as secure as it appears. There are always cracks, always blind spots, always minds inside it, learning how to break it. Roy kept reading, but now he understood something he hadn't before. This letter wasn't just a record of suffering, it was a record of intelligence, of patience, of calculated resistance. And whatever happened next wasn't random, it was planned. And plans like that don't fail quietly. They leave consequences, consequences that are messy, violent, and worth hiding. Which is exactly why this letter ended up sealed in that chest, because what Nora was about to reveal wasn't just a story, it was the moment everything went wrong.
Nora didn't rush her story. That's what made it powerful. No desperation, no scattered thoughts, just a steady unfolding, like she understood that truth, when delivered clearly, doesn't need force. It carries itself. Roy noticed that immediately, because by now he expected emotion, rage, grief, something explosive, but what he found instead was control. And control in someone who was never meant to have any is dangerous. She described how the whispers grew, slowly at first, carefully, never in groups, never in patterns that could be easily traced. One person speaking to another, then silence, then another somewhere else, like threads being woven, but never in one place long enough to be seen. That's intelligence. That's strategy. Because the system they lived under relied on visibility. It watched for gatherings, for noise, for anything that looked like coordination. So Nora and the others did the opposite. They became invisible.
And that's where things began to shift, because control depends on predictability. And the moment people stop behaving in predictable ways, the system starts to weaken. She wrote about learning more than just letters. She learned people. Who could be trusted? Who was afraid? Who might speak under pressure? Who had already been turned? Because remember what Roy saw in the ledger, has reported others. That wasn't just a note, it was a warning. The system had already planted its defenses, so Nora adapted. She didn't trust easily, didn't share everything. Information was divided, fragments only, each person knowing just enough, but never enough to destroy the whole if they were caught. You see what she was doing? She was building a decentralized structure long before the term existed, because centralized plans fail when one point breaks. Decentralized ones survive. Roy felt a strange sense of respect forming. Not admiration in a simple sense, but recognition of intelligence under pressure. Because what Nora was describing wasn't instinct, it was design. She wrote about a place, not marked on official maps, not part of the visible structure, hidden. Accessible, but unnoticed. And suddenly, Roy's eyes flicked, just for a second, toward the folded map still lying in the chest. That wasn't random. Nothing in this chest was random. The ledger showed the system. The letter showed the resistance. The map was going to show the point of collision. Roy went back to the letter, now reading faster, but not carelessly, because the tension had shifted. It was building. Nora described the turning point, not a single event, but a realization. They didn't need to fight the system directly. They needed to disrupt it, quietly, strategically, in ways that wouldn't be immediately visible. Small changes, miscounts, delays, tools misplaced, information altered. Nothing big enough to trigger immediate punishment, but enough over time to create instability. That's how intelligent resistance works, not through force, through erosion. You don't break the structure all at once. You weaken it until it collapses under its own weight. And for a while, it worked. That's the part most people don't expect. The system, so controlled, so calculated, started to show cracks. Not obvious ones, but enough. Enough for those inside it to feel something they hadn't felt before. Possibility. And that's when everything becomes dangerous, because hope is the one thing no system can allow to spread. Fear controls behavior, but hope changes it. Hope makes people take risks. Hope makes them push further than they should. Hope makes them believe they can actually win. And that's exactly what happened. Nora admitted it plainly. They got bolder, more confident, less careful. Because success, even small success, creates a false sense of security. And systems, when threatened, don't react immediately. They observe, they adapt, they wait. Roy felt his jaw tighten as he read the next lines, because now the tone of the letter changed, subtly but unmistakably. Less measured, more urgent, like the writer knew she was approaching something irreversible. And that's when you understand this wasn't just a story of resistance, it was a story of escalation, of a system being challenged and preparing to respond. And when systems like that respond, they don't correct, they don't negotiate, they don't warn. They make examples, public ones, permanent ones, the kind that reset behavior instantly, the kind that erase hope in a single moment. Roy didn't know exactly what had happened yet, but he knew this much. Whatever came next was big enough to be buried for nearly a century, and violent enough to ensure no one spoke of it again.
The shift in Nora's writing was undeniable now. The control was still there, but it was strained, like someone holding steady while the ground beneath them starts to move. You felt that before.
That moment when a situation crosses a line, when it stops being manageable and becomes inevitable, that's where she was. She didn't describe the mistake as dramatic, no sudden betrayal, no single act of recklessness, just something small, missed, overlooked, a detail that didn't seem important at the time. And that's how systems catch you. Not when you're loud, not when you're obvious, but when you think you've become invisible. She wrote, "We were seen." Not caught, not exposed, seen. There's a difference. Being caught means the act is known. Being seen means you are known, your patterns, your presence, your deviation from the norm. And once a system sees you, it doesn't need immediate action. It just needs time. Roy felt a cold stillness settle in as he read further, because now everything that followed wasn't resistance, it was consequence. At first, nothing changed. That's what made it worse. No punishment, no confrontation, no sign that anything was wrong. The routine stayed the same, the structure held, the system appeared stable. But Nora noticed it. Of course she did. Because once you start studying something closely, you pick up on shifts others miss. The watchers had changed, subtle but different, less casual, more focused. Movements that didn't match routine, eyes that lingered a second too long, questions that seemed ordinary but weren't. That's how systems respond when they're threatened. They don't panic, they tighten, they observe more carefully. They let you continue just long enough to understand the full shape of what you've built. Because taking down one person isn't enough. They want the network. They want the pattern. They want everything. And Nora realized it. Too late. That's the part that hits hardest. Not that they were discovered, but that they understood it after it had already happened, after the system had already begun closing in. She wrote about the silence. Not the one imposed from the outside, but the one that formed between them. The whispers stopped. The connections faded. Not by command, but by instinct. Because everyone felt it. Something had shifted. And when fear replaces trust, structures collapse from within. That's the weakness of decentralized systems. They're hard to detect, but once fear enters, they're even harder to maintain. Roy's grip on the letter tightened, because now the pattern was complete. Rise, adaptation, success, exposure, collapse. It wasn't random, it was predictable. And that's what made it terrifying, because it meant the system they were up against understood this cycle, had seen it before, maybe many times, and knew exactly how to end it. Nora's words grew shorter now, more direct, less reflective, like time itself had become limited. They are waiting. That line sat alone, no explanation, no elaboration, but it said everything. Waiting for what? Not information, they already had that. Not confirmation, they didn't need it. They were waiting for the right moment. Because timing is everything in control. Act too early, you expose your awareness. Act too late, you lose authority. But act at the exact right moment, and you don't just stop resistance, you erase it, completely, permanently. Nora understood that, and for the first time in the letter, there was something new. Not fear, not panic, clarity. The kind that comes when options run out, when the future narrows to a single path. She knew what was coming, not the details, not the exact form, but the nature of it. And that's often worse, because when you know something is about to happen, but you don't know exactly what, your mind fills the gaps with possibilities, and the possibilities are always worse than reality. Roy reached the final lines of the page, and for a brief moment, everything went still, because he understood something now that he hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't just about what had been done, it was about what was about to be done. Something deliberate, something calculated, something meant to send a message so clear that it would echo long after the act itself was forgotten. And if that message was strong enough, it wouldn't need to be spoken again. It would live in behavior, in silence,
in generations of people who never even knew why they feared stepping out of line, only that they did. Roy turned the page, and whatever came next wasn't going to be subtle anymore.
Roy's eyes scanned the next lines, but this page was different. No longer reflective, no longer abstract. It was tactical, precise. Nora had stopped writing about events. Now she was writing about structures, about movements, about patterns. She didn't say, "We did this." She said, "Observe the flow, track the openings, map the hesitations, exploit the blind spots." It was like she had switched from diary to manual, from narrative to blueprint. Every sentence had a purpose, every word mapped a step. And the steps weren't innocent. They were deliberate, calculated, dangerous. Roy felt it in his chest, the same cold, methodical certainty he had seen in Nora before, but now it was amplified, sharper. She outlined a sequence of actions the system could take, phrased almost as advice, almost as if she were teaching someone how to dismantle trust. But the real lesson was hidden in plain sight, not in the instructions themselves, in the why behind them. Every method served a single goal: predict human behavior, control the reactions, and manipulate outcomes without confrontation. She wasn't writing about rebellion. She was writing about inevitability. Roy's stomach turned, because he understood now what she had meant in the previous section. The system doesn't need to act overtly. It just needs to orchestrate the conditions, and everything else falls into place. Lines blurred between victim and actor, between observer and participant. By the time the system decided to intervene, it had already influenced every choice, every hesitation, every misstep. The rest of the page was a diagram, minimal, almost clinical. Lines connecting nodes, circles around names, arrows pointing toward outcomes. No labels, no explanation, just connections, cause and effect, cause and consequence. Roy stared. It wasn't just a record of what had happened, it was a prediction, a map of how things would collapse if left unchecked. And in that moment he realized Nora hadn't just been warning anyone reading her notes. She had been documenting the system itself, its methods, its reach, its logic. And for the first time, Roy truly understood the danger. Not of mistakes, not of discovery, but of knowing the rules. Because once you understand the rules, you can't unknow the consequences. And the system, it understood them too. Every deviation, every subtle misalignment, every small act of defiance. It didn't need punishment, it needed recognition. And recognition was enough to erase the comfort of ignorance. Roy closed the letter for a moment. The weight of it settled in his hands. The knowledge, the inevitability, and the quiet, lingering question. Who would act first? The observer or the observed? Roy's eyes scanned the next lines, but this page was different. No longer reflective, no longer abstract. It was tactical, precise. Nora had stopped writing about events. Now she was writing about structures, about movements, about patterns. She didn't say, "We did this." She said, "Observe the flow, track the openings, map the hesitations, exploit the blind spots." It was like she had switched from diary to manual, from narrative to blueprint. Every sentence had a purpose, every word mapped a step. And the steps weren't innocent. They were deliberate, calculated, dangerous. Roy felt it in his chest, the same cold, methodical certainty he had seen in Nora before, but now it was amplified, sharper. She outlined a sequence of actions the system could take, phrased almost as advice, almost as if she were teaching someone how to dismantle trust. But the real lesson was hidden in plain sight, not in the instructions themselves, in the why behind them. Every method served a single goal: predict human behavior, control the reactions, and manipulate outcomes without confrontation. She wasn't writing about rebellion. She was writing about inevitability. Roy's stomach turned, because he understood now what she had meant in the previous section. The system doesn't need to act overtly. It just needs to orchestrate the conditions, and everything else falls into place. Lines blurred between victim and actor, between observer and participant. By the time the system decided to intervene, it had already influenced every choice, every hesitation, every misstep. The rest of the page was a diagram, minimal, almost clinical. Lines connecting nodes, circles around names, arrows pointing toward outcomes. No labels, no explanation, just connections, cause and effect, cause and consequence. Roy stared. It wasn't just a record of what had happened, it was a prediction, a map of how things would collapse if left unchecked. And in that moment, he realized, Nora hadn't just been warning anyone reading her notes. She had been documenting the system itself, its methods, its reach, its logic. And for the first time, Roy truly understood the danger. Not of mistakes, not of discovery, but of knowing the rules. Because once you understand the rules, you can't unknow the consequences. And the system, it understood them too. Every deviation, every subtle misalignment, every small act of defiance. It didn't need punishment, it needed recognition. And recognition was enough to erase the comfort of ignorance. Roy closed the letter for a moment. The weight of it settled in his hands. The knowledge, the inevitability, and the quiet, lingering question. Who would act first? The observer or the observed?
Roy opened the next piece of parchment, brittle along the edges, its surface faintly creased from decades of careful storage. This wasn't a letter. This wasn't a ledger. It was a covenant, a formal declaration signed by the men who had controlled life and death on the Vauclair plantation and in the church that sheltered them. He traced the ink with his finger, feeling the pulse of history beneath the paper. 11 signatures, deliberate and precise, each a mark of conscious complicity. Each name carried the weight of decisions that had rippled outward, shaping lives, futures, and the very landscape of morality in Ascension Parish. As he read aloud, the significance became unbearable. These men weren't just passively aware. They weren't accidental witnesses. They were architects of suppression. The covenant bound them to silence, to concealment, to maintaining a facade of communal harmony while actively burying the consequences of human lives lost. Roy's voice faltered as he spoke each name: Aldous Vauclair, Thomas Dubois, Elias Albright, Samuel Miller, Joseph Fontenot, Caleb Bayou, Daniel Laundrie, Matthew Hebert, Paul Broussard, Peter Thibodeau, William Thorne. 11 men, men whose descendants still occupied the pews, who still carried the social power embedded in generational wealth and status. He looked up at Reverend Arsenault, whose hands trembled, grasping at the table for support. "These are our founders," the Reverend whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of realization. He had taught his congregation to revere the church's history, to trust in its moral compass, and yet here it was, a document proving that morality had been sacrificed for power, that the church had not only condoned cruelty, it had contracted it. Roy felt a deep, visceral anger, not just at the past, but at the enduring structures that had allowed it to persist unchallenged for generations. This covenant was a blueprint for control, a system designed to manipulate memory, law, and conscience. It was an ancient, living mechanism of authority, the few deciding the fates of the many, ensuring that knowledge of injustice could be contained, diluted, forgotten, or erased entirely.
He stared at the signatures again, each one a key, each one a seal of complicity, each one a reminder that institutions, no matter how sacred they appear, are only as moral as the individuals who wield them, and the systems they protect are designed to perpetuate obedience, secrecy, and suppression. Roy understood then that the ledger, Nora's letter, and this covenant were not just artifacts, they were evidence of a method, a psychological apparatus of control, stretching across decades, blending faith, power, and fear. And that method was still alive, still functioning in subtle, unseen ways. The question pressed in: how much of what he knew, what the parish knew, had been quietly shaped by these invisible mechanisms of authority? How many lives had been directed, constrained, or broken without anyone realizing it? For the first time, Roy felt the depth of the rabbit hole, and he knew he couldn't look away, because the truth, once seen, demands action, or it becomes another buried secret. He paused, letting the silence settle. Then, almost imperceptibly, he whispered to himself, "The system knows, the system watches, and the system adapts." The shadows in the kitchen seemed to lean closer, hungry for acknowledgement, as if the parchment itself had a consciousness. This was no longer history, it was a warning. And Roy, standing in that quiet room with Margaret Tour waiting, understood that he had crossed a threshold. The real descent was about to begin.
Margaret leaned forward, her fingers brushing lightly over the edges of the covenant as if feeling the energy embedded in the ink. She did not speak immediately. Her eyes, dark and sharp, scanned each signature with a depth that went beyond mere recognition. She was reading not just names, but intentions, decisions made in the shadows, calculated to control, manipulate, and erase. "You see, Roy," she finally said, her voice measured, almost cold in its clarity. "This is the blueprint of a psychological system. It's not just about who survived or who was silenced. It's about how memory itself is shaped, how generations inherit obedience, guilt, and selective ignorance." Roy nodded slowly. He could feel the weight of her words pressing against the air. It was as though the room itself had shifted, the walls now closing in with the weight of a century-long conspiracy. The covenant was proof that morality had been subverted into a tool of control, that religion and authority had been weaponized to maintain social order at the expense of truth. Margaret's gaze fell on the map next. The linen was faintly creased, the hand-drawn symbols crude yet unmistakable. 14 crosses marked the riverbank, the final resting places of those who had attempted to escape. She traced a finger along the faint path leading from the plantation quarters to the river, her expression unreadable but heavy with understanding. "These crosses," she murmured, "are not just graves, they are markers of the system's efficiency. The punishment, the betrayal, it was ritualized, organized, institutionalized, and the church, the very institution meant to guide conscience, became a collaborator." Roy swallowed hard. The ledger, the letter, the covenant, and the map, they were fragments of a single horrifying mechanism. And Margaret was right. This wasn't history that had simply been forgotten. It was history that had been deliberately managed, crafted to instill submission and obedience, to ensure the perpetuation of power. Margaret's gaze fell on the map next. The linen was faintly creased, the hand-drawn symbols crude yet unmistakable. 14 crosses marked the riverbank, the final resting places of those who had attempted to escape. She traced a finger along the faint path leading from the plantation quarters to the river, her expression unreadable but heavy with understanding. "These crosses," she murmured, "are not just graves, they are markers of the system's efficiency. The punishment, the betrayal, it was ritualized, organized,
institutionalized, and the church, the very institution meant to guide conscience, became a collaborator. Roy swallowed hard. The ledger, the letter, the covenant, and the map, they were fragments of a single horrifying mechanism, and Margaret was right. This wasn't history that had simply been forgotten. It was history that had been deliberately managed, crafted to instill submission and obedience, to ensure the perpetuation of power. Margaret's gaze met his, unflinching, as though challenging him to recognize the full scope of it. "If you understand this, Roy," she said, "you understand what they rely on. Silence, fear, complicity. They don't need overt violence anymore. They just need people who accept the narrative, who never ask, never probe, never remember." Her words struck like a hammer. Roy realized he was holding something dangerous, something that could destabilize more than just Nora. Knowledge was no longer neutral. Once unearthed, once acknowledged, it demanded decisions, consequences, movement. He exhaled slowly, letting the tension in his shoulders ease just a fraction. He could feel it, the weight of responsibility. This was no longer about Nora. It was no longer about the 14 who had died. It was about the network, the system, the hidden forces that had engineered obedience for generations. Margaret's voice broke the silence again. "We need to decide how far down we're willing to go, how much of the truth we are willing to confront, and who will be exposed if we do." Roy met her gaze, his jaw tight. The descent had begun, and there was no turning back. "Let's begin," he said, and the air seemed to shiver around them as if the past itself had awakened. The first step into the forbidden had been taken. The rabbit hole yawned wider. Roy reached for the hand-drawn map again, his fingers tracing the faded lines, feeling the subtle ridges of decades-old ink pressed into the heavy linen. Every crease, every mark was intentional. Each cross on the riverbank, each jagged path through the cane fields told a story the parish had tried to bury. The map wasn't just a representation of geography. It was a psychological diagram, a record of betrayal and survival. It was the kind of document that could unravel generations if its implications were truly understood. Margaret leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she examined the symbols. "This," she said, "is what I call the architecture of control. Look at how the paths converge, how the river acts both as escape and trap. The creator of this map knew the land intimately, but more importantly, they understood human behavior. They knew fear, loyalty, and desperation would dictate every choice made along these paths." Roy's heart thumped, a mix of dread and fascination. He realized he was staring at a system designed to predict, to anticipate, to manipulate. The 14 souls who had attempted to flee were not merely unfortunate. They were variables in a controlled experiment of power, obedience, and suppression. The river, the guards, the loyal, and the betrayers, it all formed a lattice of influence, a design meant to reinforce the supremacy of those who held the ledger, the covenant, the church, and the authority. Margaret's voice cut through his thoughts, precise and commanding. "Roy, I want you to see something crucial. Notice the distances between the crosses and the plantation. The spacing is not random. Each placement represents a failure, a calculated failure. This is psychological warfare in its purest form, disguised as historical happenstance." He followed her finger along the faint lines. Each cross represented a life ended, a hope extinguished, a story erased, but the arrangement also revealed intent. Someone had orchestrated these deaths with meticulous care, ensuring the lesson of obedience would echo far beyond the fields, into the lives of children, congregations, and townsfolk who would never know the truth. The weight of comprehension pressed down on him like a physical force. This was not just a record of cruelty, it was a blueprint of domination. The same system that had guided plantations for centuries, that had leveraged fear, surveillance, and selective mercy, was still alive in subtle ways. Its echoes persisted in communities, institutions, and hierarchies that outwardly claimed virtue while internally controlling narrative. Margaret's eyes locked onto his, unwavering. Now, Roy, we reach the part where most men stop. The ledger, the letter, the covenant, they all reveal the past, but this map, it shows the mechanics of control. If you understand this, you can begin to dismantle it. But first, she paused, leaning closer, voice dropping to a whisper that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. You must acknowledge the truth out loud. Type it into the world. Write it down. Declare it. Say it twice. Let the universe hear that you understand. Only then does the transformation begin. Roy exhaled, the room heavy with unspoken power. He realized the journey into forbidden knowledge demanded not just observation, but participation. The moment had arrived. The first symbolic phrase was whispered, then repeated, binding him to the awareness he could never unlearn. The descent into the full rabbit hole was no longer theoretical. It was absolute. And from here, there would be no innocence to return to.